back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hey guys, so I'm here today to review two science fiction books for you. The first one is Iron Gold by Pierce Brown and the second one is Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuvel, which is one of the shortlisted books for the Booktube SFF Awards. So let's start off with Iron Gold. This is a ARC copy, as you can probably see. It does have the title on the spine and on the back, but it's not a proper copy. However, my edition is signed because I did meet the author, and yeah, that was really, really cool. This is the first one in a new series by Pierce Brown, and it follows on from the events that happened in the Red Rising trilogy. So if you've not read the Red Rising trilogy, I definitely wouldn't recommend starting with this one. I think you need to read the Red Rising trilogy to make sense of this one, and also because there is just so much that's going to be spoiled if you start with this book. It's unreal. So yeah, definitely don't do that. However, if you have read the Red Rising trilogy, then you can start this one, and it's quite an interesting continuation. This is set, I think, about a decade or so later than the Red Rising trilogy ends, and so we're following some of the main characters from that series, but also a couple of new ones. One of the main characters in the previous series was Darrow. He's actually our POV character in the previous series, and in this one we actually have multiple POV, which is something quite new for Pierce, and he hasn't done that before, so it was quite a change. Now, in the previous series, I really enjoyed Darrow as a character. I liked seeing him and seeing the decisions he made and following his journey as he kind of grew up and faced things that were really hard to deal with in space, because it is in space. However, in this one, I found it was more of a struggle about big, big stakes, and actually the stakes have been risen throughout the series, but in this series, or at least this book, it's gonna be even worse. The Empire at large seems to be what is at stake now, and Darrow is very much in the thick of all of that. We have another character called Ephraim, who is a smuggler. He is a kind of main character. He comes into it a little bit more in the second half than in the first, and I was a little bit unsure about him. He's probably my least favourite of the main characters because he doesn't really do an awful lot at first, but then later on he kind of becomes much more prominent. I do think he's a character I don't like very much, and so reading from his point of view was at times a little bit boring, and at times it just felt like it was a bit forced. I didn't feel like his motivations were always clear to me, so he was my least favourite character. We then had Lyria, who is a new character. She is a Red, she is based on Mars, and she quickly gets away from Mars in the early part of this story after much of her family is killed, and she blames this on various people, and she wants to escape from where she's always been. She wants to see things, get out there, see what's really happening, because there's all these promises being thrown around, but the reality is that people on the planets are not seeing these promises come to fruition, and she wants to see if they really are out there, if people are actually taking action or not. Definitely not that fun from her point of view after her whole family's killed. And then we have Lysander, who is a major character from the previous series. He's a character who has a lot of sway in the Empire and definitely could bring about some real destruction. I thought his was quite an action-packed story throughout, and I certainly found him to be a character that I could relate to and enjoy and find interesting because his motivations were clear, even if I didn't always agree with them. So that was good, and I definitely liked him. Those are the main characters, but we do see lots of other characters from the previous series as well who kind of get a look in on their point of views. In terms of the plot, I found this a little bit harder to get into. I just found that I was very easily putting this book down and not picking it up as often as I would the Red Rising trilogy, and it's hard not to compare them because they are part of the same world. This is a new direction in that world, but it's still definitely a continuation. And I think for me, the one single main character worked better, and I think Pierce Brown was excellent at that in the Red Rising books, and I don't think it worked as well in this series for me with the multiple POV. I think possibly it was harder for him to weave everything together and make it work cohesively and really get you to grips with the character. In the first series, I found I was totally emotionally involved and invested in Darrow's story, and there's so much that he goes through that you can't help but like him. And yet in this series, or this book, even though there is a lot that the characters face, I found it harder to really get into their mindset and really connect with them. So this is focused on a world where there is just an awful lot of warfare going on at all times, and Another thing that I find really difficult is warfare and battles on a huge scale, because I find it quite hard to get into a battle if I don't have a real strong connection to the character. And although with Darrow I think that was there, the other characters it wasn't there as much, and it will probably have needed a bit more time to develop before I felt like I was totally invested. So on the whole, this is a mixed bag for me. I did really like bits of it, and particularly in the second half I found myself getting more and more sucked into the story. It has a lot more going on and it's a bit more fast and fun. However, there were some moments that I thought were just a little bit too ridiculous, and there were moments where I found myself getting a bit bored. So I gave this a 3.5. It's a very solid continuation, but it isn't my favourite, and it definitely doesn't completely fill me with excitement about the second one. However, the ending of this book is a huge cliffhanger, and it's definitely exciting. So I don't know, it's a mixed one. It is a mixed one. I'd love to hear your comments on this one down below. If you've read it, if you're planning to read it, do let me know your thoughts. The next one I want to talk about is Waking Gods, which is the second one in the Themis Files series by Sylvain Neuvel. I picked this one up on audiobook actually, and I would thoroughly recommend the audiobook to you guys, because this is told largely through letters, transcripts, radio transcripts, TV broadcasts, all sorts of things like that in obviously written form. And so there is a lot of documentation to get through, and therefore it can become a little bit overwhelming when you read it in physical format, all the numbers, all the dates, things like that. But the audiobook is actually narrated by lots of people. There's quite a few different narrators, and so it works really, really well to distinguish characters from one another and to distinguish certain situations from one another. And I thought it was fantastic. I'm not gonna lie, the audiobook narration was really good. So I definitely would recommend that. I was actually really pleasantly surprised by this book as well, because I really enjoyed the first one. I thought it was a lot of fun, but I wasn't really sure where it was going next, and I thought it was going to be quite a weird one to continue on with because I couldn't really see the direction it was going to go in. However, this story picks up not too long after the events of the first one are finished with, and we're following Rose Franklin as she heads up the team who are investigating the alien robot thing called Themis. They don't really know what this is. They've kind of done a bit of research. They've been researching it for ever since the events of the last book, but they haven't really figured it out yet, and they're a bit baffled by it, to be honest. Humanity as a whole is a bit baffled by the events that have led up to this and what it really means. It's this giant robot with knees that are backwards, and they don't know what to do with it. So at the point where we join the story, they're still investigating it. However, we pick up the story where a giant robot, much like Themis but different, has suddenly appeared in London, in the middle of London. No one knows why, it's not done anything else, it's just standing there. And the people of London are obviously concerned, they're a bit confused, they don't know where it's come from. This one seems to have people or pilots inside the robots. They're a bit worried about whether it's going to attack them, whether it's here to negotiate. They just don't know. And so we follow various different points of view, from news cameras, from radio, from BBC, from people who are in the government, through to the people on the research team in other parts of the world. And we see all of their point of view whilst this event is going on. Quickly, the government gets involved and stuff starts to escalate to the point where they're not sure whether they should try and negotiate or whether they should just open fire. And unfortunately, they may have made the wrong decision because half of London ends up in a very bad way. And this is where the real story starts taking place. Now, this does have many of the same characters from the first book, and it certainly continues to flesh them out as characters. I feel like in the first book, I couldn't quite picture each of them as individuals. They felt like they were all kind of meshing together in my head. Whereas in the second book, they all felt like individual characters, they felt unique, they felt like they really had something to offer to the story, and I just really enjoyed them. I felt like each character really got to know the reader more, and we felt a bit more involved in their personal communications. We see some recordings from some of the research team which really brought you into the lives of Vincent and Kira's relationship. I thought that was a lot stronger in this book, and seeing it from their point of view, their kind of recordings of each other chatting, really worked for me. So that definitely solidified their relationship, which is something essential to this story because they are quite pivotal main characters, along with Rose, who is having a bit of an identity crisis in this book. But it's really interesting actually, and I think the science was actually massively improved on in this book than in the first book. There's a lot of discussion of DNA, there's a lot of discussion about what it means to be human, what it means to be an alien, how interlinked are the two, where are people coming from, what is right and what is wrong when it comes to deciding DNA and genetics. It's really, really interesting actually, and it's not hard, which I was always worried about when it comes to science fiction. Would I be able to understand it? This series is definitely a series I think most people could read happily and understand the science, because it's not difficult, it's just interesting. It definitely has some cool ideas in it, and big epic giant robots is always a good thing in my book too. So it really worked for me, this story, and I feel like it was fully developed on from the first one, and I just think the audiobook was fantastic. I don't know if had I read it in physical form I would have enjoyed it quite as much as the audiobook version, but yeah, I still really, really recommend this series, and I'm actually really happy it's on the shortlist because I don't think I'd have got around to reading it anytime soon if it hadn't been, but now I have. I'm really, really pleased that I have finished it, and that I will definitely pick up the third one, I think, because I'm intrigued to see where it's going next. Like, so much happens and the stakes are real high in this story, so yeah, definitely want to know what happens next. So that I gave 4 stars, and I definitely would recommend it. I'd love to have your comments on both of those books down below. Do let me know. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Bye guys!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.